All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Create no images of God, except ACCEPT, the images that God has provided. They are everywhere, in everything. God is change. Seed to tree, tree to forest, rain to river, river to sea, grubs to bees, bees to swarm. From one, many, from many, one. Forever uniting, growing, dissolving, forever changing. The universe is God's self-portrait. These words come from the groundbreaking science fiction author Octavia Butler. A recipient of several Hugo and Nebula Awards, Butler was the first science fiction writer to receive the MacArthur Fellowship, which the prize is a strange number, like $249,000. I'm like, just one more dollar would have really done something there, but that's what it is. A Black woman, she did what few dared to do by creating Black characters, and most especially, strong, smart Black women characters. The opening words, all you touch, you change, all that you change, changes you, the only lasting truth is change, are spoken by the main character in the novel, the parable of the sower. If you have a biblical background, you may recognize the title as one of the parables told by the teacher of Galilee. When I first read the parable of the sower and its sequel, the parable of the talents, I was captivated by the theological aspects of the story of Lauren Oya Olamina's search for a belief system that resonated with her experience. Does that sound familiar? Could it be what brought you here? After years of listening to sermons and singing songs about the immutability of God and his, and it was always his, unchanging nature and rock-like stability, I was drawn to the freedom of Unitarian Universalism. Our fourth principle is affirming a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. It's hard work. And at least in my case, it's never ending. So the idea that all I touch, I change, and all I change changes me resonates deeply. And the exciting assertion that God is change blows the doors off my theological house. Octavia Butler is not the only one who looks to science fiction or speculative fiction to ask theological questions. Perhaps you've heard of a little thing called Star Trek. I know, no one's heard of it. That's sad. Theologically, the creation of a federation that includes and indeed celebrates diversity in all its manifestations, well, that sounds like what Unitarian Universalism strives to be and to model. If you have watched Star Trek: The Deep Space Nine series, you may have noticed that, first of all, everything is based on a stationary space station. They're not off going places. Things come to them. So people have to come to the space station to engage. That sounds like what we do here. Thank you all for coming. Also, the cast of Deep Space Nine has only one white male character. All of the other characters are aliens or represent human racial minorities. The station's captain is an African-American man. So let this be your invitation to indulge in a little binge watching of Deep Space Nine and maybe even Star Trek: The Next Generation. There's a lot to learn there too. The two shows portray the blessings and challenges of living in covenantal community, a community based in shared agreements and a commitment to diversity. Another speculative fiction writer and Unitarian, Kurt Vonnegut, the 100th anniversary of whose birthday is this week, notes, "What should young people do with their lives today? Many things, obviously, but the most daring thing is to create stable communities in which the terrible disease of loneliness can be cured." How, you? Creating and sustaining community is at the heart of what we call speculative fiction. Even in the most dystopian, apocalyptic fiction, whether it's The Handmaid's Tale or The Hunger Games, the saving grace is creating community and embracing or initiating change. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. But change can get you into trouble too. Take our Unitarian ancestor, Francis David, advisor to King Sigismund of Transylvania in the mid-16th century. And yes, it's okay to be excited that our heritage extends to Transylvania. It's, I think, the first time I've been able to say it like a grown-up and not do like the terrible Count Dracula. And now you'll never get that out of your head, even though I didn't say it. It was under Francis David's advice that King Sigismund created the Edict of Toleration, adding Unitarianism to the other state religions, which were Catholicism and Lutheranism. And that also opened the door to other religious ideas. But when King Sigismund died unexpectedly, that door slammed shut. Francis David continued to urge the people of the region to be open to change. He wrote books that were then banned. He continued to preach, and when churches were unwilling to have him in their pulpit, he would preach on the street corners. Francis David believed in the spirit of freedom, the spirit of change, and it was that belief and his flagrant disregard of the laws that banned change. Literally, there were laws that banned any sort of change, of speculation. Well, that landed him in the dungeon of the castle of the new king. His crime? Engaging in and promoting speculation. He was imprisoned and eventually died there because he believed that change was a good thing. He died because he promoted a speculative theology. Now, I have to admit that when I was preparing the service titles for the newsletter, I really thought that I had instantly invented the term speculative theology. I mean, it just came to me. I was like, oh, this is a great word. I feel so smart. And I was pretty pleased with myself. And then our administrator, Elaine, mentioned that she'd been watching some YouTube videos about speculative theology. Well, that burst my bubble. So I did a Google search and watched a few videos and read a few mind-numbing articles. And I can tell you that at least in Orthodox Christian circles, there has not been a lot of change since Francis David was imprisoned and martyred for promoting speculative theology. Change is hard. And at least in some circles, change is bad. And Unitarians and Universalists throughout history have embraced and promoted change, I'll say, for at least 2,000 years. Yes, our faith families really do go back that far as early manifestations of Christianity. Unitarianism proclaimed the unity of God, denying the divinity of Jesus. And Universalism proclaimed that salvation was universal. Can you hear the duh in parentheses? Of course, universalism is about universal. But universal salvation, that all souls would be reconciled to God, so there could be no hell. Those were two of the many theologies in early Christianity, depending on where one lived and what scripture may have been available to the community. You see, it was not until the Council of Nicaea in 325 of the Common Era that the Bible as we know it was created. There were many, many scriptures, letters, gospels, stories that were not included. And there were many, many variations of Christianity. that were instantly deemed heretical and punishable by death, most often burning at the stake. Unitarianism and Universalism were two of those versions of Christianity that with the stroke of a pen became heresies. And so they went underground, only to reemerge in the flourishing of the Renaissance, most notably in the 16th century. I feel like we've heard about someone from the 16th century quite recently. If only I could put my finger on it. A lot was going on in Reformation time. So I think it's time for a few definitions here. I've been tossing around the word theology as if everyone knows and agrees upon its definition. Quite simply, one's theology is one's concept of God, or the good, or that which is of ultimate importance. Theo is Greek for God, and ology is often defined as the study of. So you already know this. It is quite likely that at some point in your life you took a class in biology, the study of life, bio-life, ology, study of. Theology is the study of that which is of ultimate importance to us. In the study of religion, there are a couple of important ologies to be considered. There is soteriology, which has to do with salvation, or the pathway to reconciliation with God. You'll note that there is an assumption there that we are somehow separated from God, the good, that which is of ultimate importance. I don't necessarily share that assumption, and Unitarian Universalism certainly does not. It's why we offer child dedications, accepting a child into the community and pledging our support in raising that child, instead of child baptisms, which assume that the child has been born sinful and needs the waters of baptism to clean their soul and reconcile them to God. It is an important distinction in our theology. Another aspect of theology is theodicy, or how a religion or person explains why a perfectly good, almighty, all-knowing God permits evil. In other words, why bad things happen to good people. Well, there are some theological assumptions wrapped up in that question. First, that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and all-loving. If God, or the good, or the ultimate, is not all-knowing and all-powerful, then it could be that bad things happen just because they happen, and there really isn't a religious reason why. If you're interested in unpacking these ideas, I heartily recommend Nancy Ellen Abrams' book, A God That Could Be Real: Spirituality, Science, and the Future of Our Planet. So I want to introduce one more seminary word. I hardly get a chance to tout all the things I learned that I paid for in theological school. So you're getting it all today. This is the sum total of everything I learned, kind of. So I want to include one more seminary word to this discussion because it will act as a bridge across that perilous river known as who cares? You're thinking it, aren't you? You're like, what? Why is she saying these things? That word that is our bridge across that perilous river is hermeneutic. It's just fun to say. A hermeneutic is the lens through which we view a religious idea. So in the example of Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower, doesn't matter if you haven't read it, I've given you a blurb that it's about a young black woman who creates a theology that resonates with her own experience, right? So now you know the whole book. Still read it, it's excellent. But that's the Cliff Notes. So we could employ a feminist lens, a feminist hermeneutic, to interpret the main character's action, to kind of dig a little deeper. Oh, what if I'm looking at it this way? Or we could even go deeper than that and employ a womanist lens to interpret the main character's actions as a woman of color and all of the racial elements that might include. We might look through the lens of setting or place. A hermeneutic is simply a method to deepen our understanding, a way to see more fully what the text may offer. So I wonder what hermeneutic, what lens you employ to understand Unitarian Universalism. Perhaps it is the lens of social justice and social change, liberation theology. Or maybe it is a feminist or womanist lens, embracing the divine feminine. You might employ a lens of belonging or community. There are many ways to understand what Unitarian Universalism is to you. This just helps you to name it, rather than getting all tongue-tied when people ask you, what is that church you go to? I still get tongue-tied, so don't worry. You're not bad. And Unitarian Universalism is itself a living, changing thing. It is not static. It's not a portrait on a wall that we can then attach meaning to. We often say that Unitarian Universalism is a living tradition, and if you look at the Gray Hymnal, we think it's so much that we named our primary book of songs and readings the Hymns of the Living Tradition. Okay, we were talking about our living tradition. A living tradition is an evolving one, a changing one. All that you touch, you change. You know the rest by now. It's a reminder of the beauty and pervasiveness of change as we make our way to the center of the labyrinth that is our service. We are well and truly in the engagement part. In 1961, the Unitarians and the Universalists merged to create something new. The Unitarians had already moved pretty far left of the Protestant Christianity that had defined them for almost 2 millennia, and the Universalists slightly less so. The Unitarians looked beyond the boundaries of Christianity, embracing science, humanism, and becoming quite secular, while the Universalists, who had been trying to reform Christianity from within, began to explore expanding universalism to be more universal, more pluralistic. They were changing the very core of who they were individually, both of these faith traditions, and then they brought all of that into the mix at the merger. So some principles, shared values were quickly put together, trying to incorporate what was most important to each side of this now blended faith family. Those principles and beliefs underwent several rewrites over the decades. And finally, in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, as the 21st century was looming large on the horizon, the 7 principles that you can find in the front of the Gray Hymnal took root. Then in the early 2000s, I think it was like 2003 or 4, some adaptations to the principles were offered and rejected by the General Assembly. So the principles as we know them continued. A couple of years ago, an 8th principle was brought to us in an effort to lift up the work we need to do in the world and our institutions to truly live into our commitment of anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multiculturalism. The proposed 8th principle has a different rhythm and feel than the first 7. But that makes sense, because it was created in a different context. Although the grammar and rhythm is different, over 250 congregations have already adopted the 8th principle, and it will come, I believe, to the General Assembly this June. I leave myself room to be wrong about that. Meanwhile, with all this going on, a task force had been assigned to look at all of our existing principles, which are found in the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association, Article 2. That task force has submitted the first draft of the proposed changes to our principles, our values statements that define who we are as Unitarian Universalists. If these look familiar, it's because they're the ones we already have. This is not the draft. So this is why I personally needed to take a moment to breathe, to pause. I love our principles. I love the language of them, the ambiguity of them, the rhythm. I memorized them while I was in seminary because I could not imagine being a UU minister and not having embodied our core values, which to me is what memorization does. I was brought up memorizing Bible verses, so that's my context. One of the many things that I love about our principles in their current form is that there is room for interpretation. I feel like I have been entrusted to discover their meanings in my own life. Those are not the only meanings, but they are mine in the moment, in my changing moment. When the 8th principle was introduced, which it is currently on the screen, like many of you, I found myself responding to the words and the rhythm rather than the content. I believe we need this hermeneutic, this lens of anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multiculturalism. It's important to who we are and who we are becoming. So I'm going to read those aloud because not everyone can see the screen. So the proposed 8th principle states, we affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. So as a faith, we are at a bit of a crossroads. The 8th principle will be ready for a vote to adopt at General Assembly, although we as a congregation can certainly choose to adopt it before then. As I said, there are over 250 congregations who have done so. And so we're going to be studying this 8th principle more closely come January and February into the winter. And while that is happening, there is currently this draft proposed reinterpretation of our principles, our value statements, Article 2 of the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association. We'll also be studying that draft in the coming months and years because the process of how things make it to General Assembly to vote there's generally a 3-year time to discuss and interpret and wrestle with, and it's democracy. How about that? All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. We are in the midst of changing our religion. As Unitarian Universalists, we are probably always doing this, but the changes tend to be small and individual, so it's not as noticeable. It is a privilege to assess our beliefs, our core values, and to grow and change as the times change. As Unitarian Universalists, we must encourage speculation, or Francis David died in vain. We must make space for the young people to create the communities of belonging that Kurt Vonnegut dreamed of. We must be open to changing our religion, even when that feels like loss. You will find copies of the draft proposed changes to our principles on the table in the atrium. The atrium is that place where all the plants are. And so it's up 3 little stairs. If stairs are a problem, I'll be back there momentarily, and I will be happy to hop up those stairs and get one for you. I made 30 copies, so if families can share one, that would be super. So I encourage you to pick one up and follow these guidelines as you read. Read it the first time and observe how it makes you feel. Read it a second time and observe how it makes you think. And then read it a third time, and maybe more, before you start revising it in your head, because we are all frustrated English teachers, every single one of us. Give us a red pen, we know what to do with that. So I'll read it with your heart, read it with your mind, and then keep reading it before you start rewriting it, offering suggestions. So I will also be sending out an email that talks about General Assembly and has the link to these. So if reading, having it via computer is easier for you, it will be going out as an all-church email. So trying to do all the things. So let me close with the Hopi prophecy with which I close each Saturday morning Zoom gathering. From the Hopi elders to my fellow swimmers. Here's a river flowing now very fast. It is so great and swift that there are those who will be afraid, who will try to hold on to the shore. They are being torn apart and will suffer greatly. Know that the river has its destination. The elders say we must let go of the shore, push off into the middle of the river, and keep our heads above water. And I say, see who is there with you and celebrate. At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves. For the moment we do, our spiritual growth and journey come to a halt. The time of the lone wolf is over. Gather yourselves. Banish the word struggle from your attitude and vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in a sacred manner and in celebration, for we are the ones we have been waiting for.